sí podemos traducir preguntas del público. Así que cuenten con eso. Tanto, bueno, yo, Micaela, Andrés, Francisco, bueno, podemos hacer eso. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for being here today. Welcome to this workshop, which is dedicated to Professor Zahavi's latest book, Being We. You can see the book there, just the cover. And we are very happy to have you here, and especially we are delighted to have you here then, and to have the opportunity to discuss your book with you. And I would like to say that, as you know, this is the first of a series of activities and lectures that Dan will be given this month in March in Buenos Aires. Not only here, so here we will also have another event on March 20th. And but on Monday, at the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, el 9 de marzo, este lunes, there is another event with Professor Horacio Banega, who is back there. And then there is at the Universidad Católica on March 12th, and at UBA, Faculty of Philosophy of the University of Buenos Aires, March 25. Okay, many events. But in any case, you can ask us about the dates or the details. And I will just take 1 minute before we begin to thank all of you, and especially people who travel from other parts of Argentina and even from outside of Argentina. We have people from Córdoba, like Professor Ariela Batán-Horenstein, who came specially for this workshop. And we have people from Mar del Plata, and people from Chile, from Brazil, many places. So I know this took a lot of effort, and we are living in a very difficult situation, and this is very, very valuable and meaningful. That's why I would like to sincerely thank everyone for making this possible. And a special thanks to the commentators for their expertise, for accepting this invitation. And I personally would like to thank everyone who last year accepted the invitation to form a reading group to prepare this workshop, and even people who I had never met in person, many people. Maybe people I knew but never met in person. Everyone agreed and were really enthusiastic about this, and collaborated and committed to this organization. So I'm really grateful, and I think this is very valuable. And I wanted to highlight this because it's really a workshop that is really the result of a collective effort and collaboration. So that's why I wanted to mention that. So now I will briefly explain how the workshop will be organized. Maybe you saw these there in the tables outside. We will now have a presentation by Professor Dan Zahavi. Then we will move on to some commentaries on his book. Then we will have a coffee break. Then we will have another set of commentaries. And then we will open the discussion for the public so everyone can participate. So now I will just stop talking and introduce Professor Dan Zahavi. As you know, Dan Zahavi is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen. He is author of many books and many articles, thousands, I think, on selfhood, intersubjectivity, consciousness, and his work has been translated into 32 languages. Is that right? Okay, more or less. And I will mention just some of these publications, which are Husserl and Transcendental Intersubjectivity, Self-Awareness and Alterity, Subjectivity and Selfhood, Phenomenology, the basics, and the phenomenological mind, Husserl's legacy. These are only a few of some of his works. And today he will be presenting his most recent book, Being We, Phenomenological Contributions to Social Ontology. So the floor is yours, Dan. Thank you very much.
So before starting, I think this is probably better. So before starting, I really want to express my deep gratitude to all the organizers for planning this. I mean, it's something we have been talking and thinking about for quite a long while, and I was very honored also by the interest that a lot of people from Argentina expressed when I said that I would be happy to come and give talks here. And of course, as some of you will know, I mean, I see familiar faces among you. I mean, this is not the first time I've been to Buenos Aires. It's a great pleasure being here the first time, which was in 2018 in October, this very room. I think it was together with Sean Gallagher. So it's a very great pleasure for me to return. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss my work with you through this afternoon, and for that matter also in the coming weeks. So again, first of all, thanks so much to all of you, to all the organizers, especially to Celia for taking the time to organize this. I also think I would want to say that the way I've looked at the workshop, I mean, obviously my book is somewhat in the focus, but I also think a productive way of looking at what we are going to do this afternoon is not just to look at it as a discussion of the book, but rather as a discussion of themes and topics that we all have an interest in. And so I also think, I mean, and I hope this is the way the discussion will evolve, that it won't so much be ping pong between me and you and me trying to defend myself or something like that. I think it's more about really exploring, you know, again, issues and topics that we have an interest in. And so I think the final thing I want to say is also just, I mean, in terms of what I have prepared. I mean, so obviously I assumed also after having heard about the reading group, I mean, that at least many of you will be familiar with the book. So, you know, going on for a very long time about its content didn't strike me as being perhaps the best way of using our shared time. So what I've done is to prepare a fairly short kind of summary of the main ideas of the book. And I mean, I don't think it will take me much more than 20 minutes or so. So let me try to share that with you, and then we should basically go into the discussion. So the capacity to engage in collective intentionality, to jointly be directed at objects and goals, to solve tasks, reach decisions, and share emotions together is a key feature of human sociality. It's also a feature that has been intensively discussed and explored by a number of disciplines, including social psychology, cognitive and developmental psychology, economics, sociology, political theory, anthropology, and social neuroscience in recent years. And interestingly, much of this empirical work has drawn inspiration from and relied on seminal contributions by a handful of analytic philosophers, notably Bradman, Gilbert, Searle, and Tuomela. Now, the debate on collective intentionality in analytic philosophy has lasted for around 4 decades, but obviously discussions of the nature of intentionality and also of the relation between individuality and community are far older. And one can find, I think, a very fruitful and fertile discussion of these topics in the work of early phenomenologists such as Husserl, Reinach, Scheler, Stein, Walter, Schütz, and Gurwitsch. Now, Husserl might initially have focused on the structures of the individual mind, but the focus very quickly expanded, and by the onset of World War I, he and other phenomenologists were already working on topics such as emotional sharing, intentional intertwinement, communal experiences, group memberships, and the relation between the I and the we. I think one of the noticeable features of the phenomenological approach to these topics was that phenomenologists early on recognized that feeling and thinking and acting as part of a we transforms one's sense of self, one's relations to others, and also the way that one experiences the world. And so what characterizes this early work on collective intentionality was that it was really embedded within a more comprehensive investigation of the relationship between self-understanding, interpersonal understanding, and group identity. And I think this makes for a somewhat different perspective on these issues than the perspective that is offered us by recent analytic philosophy. Now, one can approach the issue of collective intentionality and communal experiences from different angles with different research agendas in mind. And the ambition of Being We was, first of all, to highlight and assess the distinct contributions to collective intentionality and social ontology that we find in the work of the early phenomenologists. Second, and more importantly, the book systematically defends the claim that a thorough investigation of what it means to come together as a we must bridge the prevalent compartmentalization of research on selfhood, social cognition, and collective intentionality, and ultimately clarify the complex interrelation between the first person singular, the second person singular, and the first person plural perspective, that is between the I, the you, and the we. Now, Being We is divided into three parts. The first part explores the relation between we and I, between collective identity and self-identity. Can we understand what it means to feel and think and act as part of a we if we lack a proper grasp of what it means to be a self? The second part focuses on the relation between we and you. How is collective intentionality and the we perspective related to social cognition and interpersonal understanding? I mean, do we not have to have a proper account of how we come to understand and relate to others if we are to understand what it means to share belief and intention and emotional experience, or more generally, a perspective with others? The third part and final part of Being We focuses on varieties of we. Social reality is complex, it's multifaceted, and it contains many different we formations. And that, of course, gives rise to the question of how we should understand their internal relation. I mean, what is the relation between transient dyads and enduring communities? How is the coherence, unity, and persistency of different forms of we's constituted? What forms of collective intentionality do they each allow for? And what type of self-experience and interpersonal understanding do they each require and involve? So that was very, this was an attempt to kind of give you a very quick overview of the entire book. And what I want to do now is basically to go to each of the three parts and say a bit more about that, and then kind of wrap up and conclude. So the first part, we and I. J. Garfield recently wrote, and I quote, that selves could never facilitate our moral or collective lives. They could only get in the way, unquote. Now, I think it's fair to say that a central aim of part one is not only to argue that a comprehensive account of collective intentionality must address the relation between the first person plural and the first person singular perspective, the aim is also to defend the view that individual selfhood, rather than being irrelevant for or even an obstacle to a correct account of social and communal life, is crucial if we want to do justice to the distinctive being together of self and others that is characteristic of different we formations. Now, in contrast to various kinds of sets or aggregates, being a member of a we that is participating in a first-person plural relationship is something that requires an experiential anchoring. A we is in the first instance a plural subject. It's not an externally observed entity, it's something that is experienced from within. To put it differently, when adopting a we perspective, one is adopting a first-person plural perspective. One is not leaving the first-person point of view behind. This was a point that David Carr already made 40 years ago. So being a member of a we is clearly something that involves awareness of oneself as a member or participant. And I mean, the nature of that awareness is something that can be discussed further, doesn't have to be reflective, it could also be pre-reflective. But the we is not just a first-person plural, it's also a first-person plural. That is, it's something that requires plurality. So heterogeneity is an essential part of a we relationship. And since that is the case, I think any suggestion to the effect that the we either precedes or abolishes individual differentiation, be it on the level of identity or on the level of experience, must be rejected as incoherent. A we, a plural subject, is not a free-floating entity. It's something that is constituted by subjects in relation. We relationships presuppose genuine diversity and difference that is then, of course, bridged rather than erased or dissolved. So the basic point I'm trying to make is that a plurality of individual minds is a precondition for rather than an obstacle to genuine we phenomena. And if you were to eliminate the first person singular, as Garfield tends to do, who, for those of you who do not know him, is a very eloquent Buddhist scholar, I think you will lose the first person plural as well. If you deny the reality of the I and the self, you also have to reject the existence of the you and the other. And I think that also means that you have to give up on the we. Now, arguing that the coming together as a we with others necessitates rather than extirpates an appeal to individual selfhood is not to say that any notion of self will do. I mean, if we relationships are to be intelligible, I think we need to move beyond the forced choice between an account of self that either sees it as a socially determined epiphenomenon or conceives of it as a disembodied agent that operates completely free of culture and history. I mean, on my view, both of these conceptions or notions are not just wrong, but the idea that we would have to choose between them, I think, also obfuscates the need for a multidimensional account. That is an account of self that does justice to both the normative and the experiential aspect of selfhood. I think that if robust we identities and communal experiences are to be possible, both aspects of self need to be accommodated. So we need an account of intentional life that captures the first personal perspectival character of consciousness. If we didn't have that dimension, we would not have an experiential perspective on anything, and I don't think we would then be able to get to the first person plural. But as necessary as this dimension is, it's also not sufficient, because to be part of a we is to relate to other members in a distinct way. And I will say more about that shortly. you have to see a certain commonality between yourself and other co-members. You must identify with them. But in order to explain how an identification of, say, other members of your family, or identification with a political party or a religious sect or a national community is to be possible, I think we need a more robust notion of self-identity than simply being a subject of experience. Only a self whose self-understanding gravitates around socially available roles and typifications will be able to identify with others who partake in similar roles and share similar norms and values. Only a being whose identity is defined in terms of features that are shareable, such as roles, narratives, commitments, and values, can group identify, can come to experience itself as a member of a we, can come to see itself as one of us. So that was part one. And again, just to recapitulate, the first part of being we argues that a we requires a plurality of antecedently individuated selves, and that a convincing account of the first person plural perspective requires an elucidation and appreciation of the first person singular perspective. But clearly, that can only be part of the story, because a we also involves more than one member. And whether I counts as a member also depends upon whether others recognize me as such. So to put it differently, there is more to the we than me. And as important as it is to get clear on the relationship between the I and the we, as important it is to get clearer on the relationship between the prospective members of the we. Because if we wish to understand what it means to share a belief or an intention or an emotional experience, or more generally a perspective with others, we need to look at how we relate to and understand each other in the first place. It is, however, one thing to concede that we intentionality requires some capacity for social cognition, some, here I quote Searle, some sense of the other person as a candidate for shared intentionality, unquote, or, to quote Turmola, some direct or indirect communication or signaling between the participants, unquote. I mean, admitting that some kind of communication or some kind of signaling has to occur still leaves an open question whether all accounts of social cognition and all types of social cognition are equally conducive to the emergence of a we perspective. I mean, is it enough simply to be able to single out and relate to others as special kinds of entities, say, agents with intentions? Or does we intentionality require a distinctive kind of interpersonal relationship? Now, if one looks again at the analytic discussion of collective intentionality, I mean, insofar as that discussion have at all addressed the question of social cognition, I mean, people participating in that discussion have tended to favor rather demanding, rather cognitively sophisticated accounts of social cognition, and have appealed to meta-representations, to inferential mind reading, to explicit perspective taking, and to joint commitments. And I think that what we find in early phenomenology is a very different account. I mean, many of the early phenomenologists insisted on the role of empathy, insisted on the role of second personal engagement, emotional sharing, and argued that those types of relations have a particularly important role to play for the emergence of a we perspective. Now, let me very briefly outline two different accounts of how we can obtain knowledge of other minds. I mean, on a currently still popular view, the minds of others are hidden and invisible, and their mental states, and I quote, inherently unobservable entities. unquote. So that's one perspective. On another perspective, the observation of bodily expressions, of expressive behavior, can actually inform us about the other's minds. So have that alternative in mind, and then consider the following case of emotional sharing. A group of friends is gathered for a meal. They enjoy each other's company. Somebody makes a funny face, and they all laugh together. Now, if asked which of the two accounts I just presented you with would be best aligned with, best capable allowing for something like that kind of emotional sharing, I think the answer should be fairly obvious, because were we to assume that the first view was correct, were we to assume that consciousness is at best a private phenomenon that is invisible to others, I hardly think it would make sense to speak of shared experiences in any but the most metaphorical sense. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that phenomenologists, by and large, have sided with the second view. I mean, as they would argue, the challenge we are faced is not to bridge a gap between mindless behavior and disembodied mentality. No, if there is a challenge, it is to understand the link between early forms of perceptually grounded interpersonal understanding, something that is often called empathic understanding by the phenomenologists, and then more sophisticated and intellectual demanding forms of social cognition. And if we are to apply that, to the case of emotional sharing, I think the argument would be that if subjects are to be able to feel something together, well, then it would not be sufficient for them merely to know indirectly, inferentially, or through imaginative perspective taking about each other's emotions. No, rather, the participants would have to be open to each other, would have to be in possession of a particular kind of experiential acquaintance and connectedness. They would need to enjoy a perceptually based access to the here and now presence of each other's emotional lives. And not only that, no, the respective experiences would also have to be constitutively interdependent and co-regulated. So feeling something together, sharing a perspective together, I mean, it's not just a question of two individuals having experiences of a somewhat similar character that is running in parallel. As Gerda Walter puts it, when emotions are shared, each partner is not only conscious of the other's emotions, but identifies with and incorporates the other's perspective. And that is also why the ownership of shared experiences are kind of crucial. I mean, the joy, the admiration, the anger is no longer merely experienced by me as yours or mine. No, it's experienced by me as ours, our anger, our joy, our admiration. That is, as experiences that are co-owned. Now, how is that to happen? Well, one of the central arguments found in early phenomenology and then explored extensively in Being With concerns the significance of reciprocal empathy and second-person engagement. One of the central arguments concerns the claim that the togetherness of collective intentionality is in the first instance the outcome of a situation where participants do not merely relate to each other as objects of observation, but as co-subjects, as bound together second-personally in processes of mutual address. Now, there has been a lot of interest in the second-person perspective in recent years, not just in philosophy of mind, also in philosophy of language, philosophy of law, in ethics, but also in a variety of other non-philosophical disciplines such as developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience. But I think in all of that discussion, there has been rather little focus on the link between the second person and the we. And I think the contrast to early phenomenology is fairly striking. So let me give you just one central passage from Husserl. I quote, "All society is based on the actual connex of the communicative community, the mere community of address and uptake of address, or more precisely, of addressing and listening. In addressing and taking up the address, me and another I reach a first unification. I not only form myself, and the other is not only another in front of me, rather the other is my you. And in addressing, listening, and replying, we already form a we that is unified and communalized in a particular manner. So not only does the second personal communicative connection allow the participants to share, shape, and co-create their experiences in such a way that the sharedness becomes a constituent part of the experiences, but standing in a communicative relation of mutual address is precisely a process that affects and transforms the self and other experience of the participants. I mean, you experience the other as a subject with a perspective on yourself and vice versa. And it's precisely this intentional intertwinement, this incorporation of perspectives that I think is required if a sense of togetherness and what it's like for usness is to emerge. So that was about the second part, and finally about the third part. And again, just to recap, the second part of being we argues that participation in a we experience, the ability to feel, think, and act as part of a we, and to experience oneself as one of all us, calls for a socially mediated self-experience, one involving experiencing oneself through the eyes of the other, and that this is what second personal engagement, where you're not only aware of the other, but also aware of yourself as being attended to by the other, allows for. Now, Alfred Schütz once argued that the living we relationship of the face-to-face provides the basis for one's familiarity with the much wider social world, and that our social life consequently starts with an engagement with particular others. Now, as much as this is true, one also has to realize that an account of we that only focuses on second-person dyadic interactions is too limited and too restrictive. The we can differ in size and duration. It can also differ in the extent to which it involves normative structures and hierarchical power relations. I mean, you can constitute a we together with your partner, your family, your interest group, your local or national community. I mean, you may even identify and consider yourself a member of global humanity. But these are all different types of we's with different characters and structures, and they cannot be accounted for simply by scaling up the dyadic account. Some of them can survive membership replacement. Some have specific normative prerequisites. Some of them draw on shared customs and traditions. Some involve divisions of roles and positions. Some require out-group demarcations, and some of them affect our self-identity in much stronger ways than others. So far from merely being bound to dyadic interaction, we can also be based on shared heritage and culture involving conventions, norms, and institutions where we do things in a certain way. I mean, we are, after all, not just individuals who on occasion act with others. We are also community members. We are shareholders of collective identities. And our being with others is often supported by different communal practices, by different institutionalized, ritualized, and linguistically mediated norms and conventions. I mean, as a result of my socialization, my upbringing, my enculturation, I might come to value and will and think like other members of my community. I might develop a deep sense of belonging to that community. I might come to perform actions and have experiences that are not simply characterized or experienced as an I do, but as this is how we feel about matters. This is how we do things. So community membership has clear normative implications and tend to guide how we think and feel and act even when we are de facto alone. So what part 3 does is basically to move beyond the somewhat formal character of the preceding 2 parts by looking at a variety of different we formations. It discusses different types of dyadic we relationships, considers love and friendship as examples of intimate we relationships. It examines the relation between the dyadic we and the more anonymous we of larger groups. It discusses the role of triadic interaction for that transition. It looks at the difference between we relationships that are established in order to reap the benefits of the coordinated activities and we relationships that are based on shared heritage and culture. And it finally discusses the specific character of the national we and the extent to which such a we is conditioned by quite specific ideological and organizational forces. So just to conclude, basically what the phenomenological proposal that is developed in Being One does is to reject the schema of individualist reductionism, according to which a we relationship is nothing but the aggregation of its individual parts, as well as the charybdis of collectivist social constructivism, according to which a we has ontological priority over its members. Both of these positions are criticized and rejected. Being We defends the view that an in-depth analysis of collective intentionality has to engage much more explicitly with questions pertaining to the nature of selfhood and social cognition that has been customary in recent years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you for this overview of the content of the book. And now we will move on to the commentaries. We will have first Professor Ariela Batan-Horenstein. And yeah. Okay, we will invite also Alejandro La Regina because we will have like 2 sets of commentaries. First, Ariela and Alejandro, and then Robson, Veronica, and Magdalena. So I will introduce our first commentators. Professor Ariela Batan, she has a degree in philosophy and a degree in history and a PhD in philosophy from the National University of Córdoba. She is currently an independent researcher at CONICET, and she's associate professor in the course Antropología Filosófica, Philosophical Anthropology at the School of Philosophy and Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities. Since 2022, she serves as director of the Institute of Humanities, which is Unidad Ejecutora, joint research institute of CONICET and at the National University of Córdoba. Thank you very much, Professor. And so we are very happy to hear your comments. I will then present Alejandro.
I'm really happy to be here. Oh, right. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Celia, Veronica, Azul, Francisco, Andrés, Micaela, for inviting me to participate in this event. And of course, Professor Zahavi for joining us today and providing us with the valuable opportunity to discuss his latest work. Zahavi's book, Being We, Phenomenological Contribution to Social Ontology, is considered a fundamental text for scholars of phenomenology and more specifically for those interested in what Foucault called the historical ontology of ourselves. This text is particularly relevant in the context of contemporary challenges such as the rise of right-wing politics, wars, and the growing influence of technology in everyday life. In his book, Zahavi tackles the philosophical reflection on the concept of we, employing the tools of phenomenology and engaging in dialogue with sociology and other contemporary philosophical traditions. From Zahavi's proposal, which is vast and theoretically profound, as we saw before, I would like to highlight, in my view, the three major contributions to the clarification of collective intentionality. First, I want to emphasize the starting point. Zahavi begins his inquiry into the nature of the we and the condition of possibility of togetherness with a philosophical clarification of selfhood. In addressing the concept of individualist bias, Zahavi undertakes a pursuit of the collective experience guided by the theoretical premise that, I quote, "We cannot understand what it means to feel, think, and act as a part of the we if we lack a proper grasp of what it means to be a self," end of quote. The priority attributed to the first singular perspective is not only the topic considered in part one, but also, in my opinion, also the narrative thread that structures and organizes the entire work. Therefore, it can be posited that the preliminary investigation of subjectivity and self-awareness is subsequently broadened and refined through the examination of IU relationships and the issue of the second person. This ultimately ends up in the final section of the book, where the study of the diverse experience of togetherness is undertaken, with a particular emphasis on the strong we perspective, which encompasses an ethos, defined as a set of goals, beliefs, values, norms, and practices that is collectively shared. This line of argument, which allows Zahavi to circumvent the issue raised by social constructivism, also avoid the solipsist and substantialist understanding of subjectivity. Zahavi proposes an experiential minimal self as a condition of the we perspective and as the agent in we relations. Secondly, it is crucial to emphasize the pivotal role that experience plays in the examination of both the individual self and the collective we. This suggests that prior to the linguistic use of the pronoun in the first person plural, and even prior to the formation of a sense of togetherness through knowing or being combined that we constitute a we, it is possible to discern a pre-reflexive sense of togetherness. This sense, also called for usness, is considered, I quote, a specific intentional intertwinement involving processes of empathy, address, and identification. Professor Zahavi had talked about that before. Consequently, the linguistic and epistemic dimension of we relations are based on the phenomenological experiential dimension. Zahavi recognizes the significance of cognitive processes of identification. However, he cautions that that when these processes are overly demanding, they impede the attribution of collective intentionality of young children. For this reason, he asserts that, quote, we should not overlook the existence of more basic, affective, and pre-reflective form of identification, end of quote. Last but not least, I would like to stress that the critique of the functional understanding of the we experience is a central point of the work. The critique encompasses not only the idea that we identities signify a state of undifferentiation in early childhood as postulated by developmental psychology, but also the conception of the we identity as a posteriori thematic possibility of fusion through the manifestation of voluntary submission or subordination to a sect, party, group, etc. Zahavi's work acknowledges the transformative effect of we memberships on individual identities. In this sense, the concept of unity and identification are prerequisites for the establishment of collective intentionality. Nevertheless, this does not imply the abandonment of the requirement of plurality and difference among individuals. A partial reconstruction of the work was therefore conducted with a focus on the priority of the self and experience, and on the dual requirement of identification and plurality. This approach revealed an aspect that had not been, in my opinion, considered in the exhaustive and detailed analysis of the problem of collective intentionality. Specifically, I am referring to the absence to a discussion on the centrality of the body in the we experience. From the outset of the work, it is important to note that Zahavi posits an embodied self as the fundamental point of departure for the analysis. Furthermore, in most cases, he considers the bodily dimension of subjectivity and asserts that corporeality, along with consciousness, constitute a concrete and empirical limit to fusion. The examples mentioned by Zahavi also serve to corroborate that he's not talking about brains in a vat or disembodied entities. It is my contention that the given examples, which involve or include moving a table, walking together, playing instruments in an orchestra, or celebrating a victory with teammates, among others, allude to an instrumental concept of corporeality. In the context of such experiences, the body appears as an instrument, that is, as a means for the realization of a joint action by goal-oriented intentional consciousness. Consequently, there appears to be a discrepancy between the assertion that the subject is embodied and the allusion to examples that imply an instrumental understanding of the body. The repeated use of the adjective embodied does not clarify what Zahavi means by body or what the bodily dimension of we experience consists of. Some clues of answering this question can be found in Zahavi's referral to the Husserlian understanding of corporeality as the center of orientation and perspective in the world we inhabit. However, this definition is problematic if the objective is to elucidate the nature and structure of the social world, that is, a world constituted by much more than just orientation and perspectives. In my opinion, the privilege of self as a starting point for understanding we relations has the consequence of privileging proprioceptive and kinesthetic bodily experience. That is to say, the experience that I have of my own body and which is denied regard the other person's body, and vice versa. These findings suggest a limitation in the understanding of the we experience, particularly when considering its multimodal and synesthetic nature. This raises the question of whether an embodied we is possible. While the answer is affirmative, further elucidation is required in order to ascertain the nature and definition of corporeality to which is to be ascribed. In accordance with Zahavi's proposition, it can be said that just as the we is not constituted by mere addition of selves, the embodied we should not be a mere sum of bodies. Of course, the reference to an embodied we does not allude to an animated materiality of indiscernible parts, but rather to the we bodily experience that arises from the life-haptic encounter of the individual self. However, from a phenomenological perspective, it is not possible to assert the univocity of the concept of the body. Therefore, it is necessary to elucidate the nature of the embodied we, with particular attention to the original distinction between the notion of Leibkörper and Leibkörper. Disregarding the dimension of the physical body, Körper, it is the body in its dual dimension as Leib and Leibkörper, which constitutes a principle of differentiation as required by the plurality of the we. But it is also a principle of unification and reciprocal action. It is not possible to elaborate further on this topic at this stage, and just to conclude, I will mention a few examples of embodied we that could reveal different dimensions of corporeality and structural layers of experience. However, this will be examined in more detail in an upcoming study. The first examples I would mention are respiration and heartbeat. These are subpersonal and physiological processes in which young children and their caregivers, as well as couple in love, experience themselves as embodied we. In both cases, synchronization and reciprocal action are observed because, as empirical research show, the breathing and heartbeats of two individuals living together have the ability to regulate each other in a kind of dialogue, organic dialogue. Secondly, and in addition to the examples of walking together or playing an instrument together already considered by Professor Zahavi, I could add dancing together. In such cases, one observes a tactile, kinesthetic, and motor togetherness that is pre-reflexive and does not exist prior to the encounter of the bodies. Thirdly, there are examples of mass bodily phenomena, such as street demonstrations, being part of a group of football supporters at a match, and collective dancing. In such experiences, characterized by the absence of one-to-one direct interaction and the presence of an anonymous crowd, individuals find themselves temporarily immersed in a state of undifferentiated embodied we. This phenomenon always occurs in the synesthetics and multimodal world that include the sense of touch, sound, sight, and smell. Many times more smell than the other. No? The fourth example, which may be regarded as the most controversial, concerns affective resonance as a form of togetherness at a distance, whereby there is a virtual encounter of gestural or sonic corporeality, such as in phone and video calls. These examples differ from the previous three in that it lacks the live haptic encounter. In conclusion, I hope that these examples provided herein have served to illustrate the central aspect of this commentary and to demonstrate the necessity of complementing studies on collective intentionality with a comprehensive analysis of corporeality. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Zahavi for inspiring this reflection, and I would be very much welcome his thoughts on the matter. Thanks.
Thank you, Ariela. Yeah, this is very nice to see how the book inspired such interesting and important topics and discussions. So now I will introduce. Sí, te tienes que sentar ahí y ¿sabes qué tienes que hacer? Tienes que abrir ahí tu texto para poder proyectarlo. Nos olvidamos, no, disculpame, yo me olvidé de decir. ¿Vos lo querés proyectar, Ale?
Sí, se puede. Sí.
Dale, sí, está acá. Ahora. Está acá. En el escritorio de la computadora, está. Acá. Y abrilo y después comparto. Perdón, la idea era que comparta. I forgot before to share the text that Ariela prepared. That was my mistake. Maybe it's the heat came to my brain. So I will introduce our next commentator, Alejandro La Regina. He has a degree in philosophy from the University of Buenos Aires. He is currently a jefe de trabajos prácticos, which I have no idea how to translate into English, but it's like professor at the in the course Gnoseology at the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Philosophy and Letters of the University of Buenos Aires. And he's a member of the UBA Seed Research Project directed by Professor Horacio Banega, which is called Husserlian Models of Empathy and Intersubjectivity. And he's completing his PhD in philosophy at the University of Buenos Aires. So thank you, Alejandro. And okay, you may begin.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Celia. I would like to begin by thanking Celia Cabrera, Sul Katz, Francisco Diez, Verónica Kreschel, Andrés Oswald, and Micaela Seftel for organizing this activity and generously inviting us to participate in it. To Professor Zahavi for giving us the opportunity to benefit from his presence, his listening, and his words, enabling the construction of this collective commentary on his latest work and promoting a priceless experience for us. Professor Zahavi's book takes us from the fundamental importance of the minimal self, its subsequent extension, the link from a second-person IU perspective in the dyads and triads of love and friendship, to higher order personalities and nationalism. This journey is based on more than 30 years of research and academic production on the topics of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, which serve us as a reference for the deployment of condensed concepts and arguments. Although this development of the experience does not appear to be presented from a normative, ethical, or political standpoint, this analysis could have implications in those fields, as reflected in the recovery of Plessner's thinking towards the end of the work. This will not be the first time that Professor Zahavi has made contributions from a phenomenological perspective to fields of knowledge that intersect with ethics and politics. Throughout his vast output, Professor Zahavi has dealt on several occasions, on several occasions, with the phenomenology of care, mainly in nursing, 2019, 2020, 2024. I won't quote every work, just a few. In fact, we are excited to hear the professor speak at this upcoming lecture on March 12th, Empathy, Morality, and Care at the UCA Faculty of Philosophy. Thinking about care stems from an interest in others, an ethical stance, and, if you will, a political one. This has been demonstrated by the tradition of care ethics, which, according to Victoria Camps, was founded by Carol Gillian in her work In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, 1982, and developed by the feminist and critical tradition. For our part, we find more or less explicit antecedents in the classical phenomenological tradition in Levinas, Ricoeur, and Merleau-Ponty, and in a certain sense also in Heidegger and Husserl. Camps states, quote, "The caring relationship responds to the claim of the concrete person, to the face of the other, in Levinas' terminology, to the realization that we are bodies that are happy and sad, that enjoy and suffer, and not abstractions. It requires solicitude assistance, attention, concern, and presupposes a certain empathy. This attention can only be situated, personal, and singularized, centered on the person, camps. On the other hand, in contemporary phenomenology, there has been extensive development around the description of the phenomenon of care since Patricia Benner highlighted it in 2001, as well as its multiple relationships with empirical research. In this commentary, I would like to revisit some issues related to empathy and second-person commitment presented by Professor Zahavi in the second part of Being We in relation to the we experience, reciprocity, mutual awareness, and communication with regard to the IU relationship in a possible minimal community of care, dyadic and or triadic. In chapter 8, Professor Zahavi explores the concept of empathy and 30 years of work he has done, and how it operates in our experiential relationships. This concept, studied as a way of accessing the experience of the other and its role in the constitution of intersubjectivity, finds practical applications in the phenomenology of nursing, Zahavi Martini 2019, Fernandez and Zahavi 2020-2021, and Zahavi 2024, for example. Empathy is the model of access to the experience of the other, maintaining the difference between self and other, differentiating itself from imaginative perspective taking and affective share. First, Zahavi distinguishes affective empathy from cognitive empathy to lead us to the basic Husserlian conception of empathy, which allows for a direct experiential acquaintance with the psychological life of others, always partial, open, and correctable. The example used to illustrate this difference is one in which Zahavi asks us to put ourselves in the shoes of a nurse who has a new patient whom her colleagues have told her is afraid of needles. We could try to imagine how he will feel when she wants to inject the medication. When we meet the patient, we perceive the tension, the expression on his face, the tone of his muscles. We experience his fear without the need for inference. But it is also clear that we do not feel the same fear as the patient. We do not share the same fear. We perceive his. This example can serve us to illustrate the different types of empathy that are later distinguished in chapter 9. If we consider that the nurse, while her colleagues were informing her of the situations, looks through the window of the room at the patient while he looks at the floor, we will be witnessing unidirectional empathy. If the patient then looks up and directs his gaze at the group of nurses, and in particular at the one who will give him the injection, but their eyes do not meet, we will be looking at a simultaneous or parallel empathy. Let's assume that at that moment, the patient meets the nurse's gaze and that empathy becomes reciprocal. But we still do not have an IU relationship. Let us continue with this example. The nurse leaves the group of colleagues and opens the door to the room, greets the patient, and their eyes, words, and bodies meet face to face. In the conversation, the nurse inquires about the patient's situation, asks his name, although she already knows it, his details, although she already knows them, asks him how he feels, if he is calm, and continues the conversation from you to you, from I to you, and vice versa, in a mutual recognition and commitment in that care situation. The patient feels calmer, the nurse more prepared to move forward with the treatment. their emotional states changed during the conversation, as did their postures and muscle tones. From mutual empathy, we move to a true IU relationship. Throughout the example, we move from a nurse's day orientation towards a patient, anonymous, typical in Schutzian terms, to a you orientation in face-to-face conversation. It will appear that in this situation, the requirements established for accounting for a relationship from a second-person perspective in the development of Chapter 9 are met. Mutual address, communicative connection, engagement, and reciprocity in addressing and communicatively reaching some with one interacts. This gives rise, in Husserl's terms, to a communicative community, in which the participants are within each other. These requirements make it clear that the second-person perspective cannot be adopted alone, which Eiland calls the mutual interdependence claim, in which I and you are codependent. Husserl adds to this that the second-person commitment, quote, involves not merely an awareness of the other, but also, and at the same time, a form of interpersonal or socially mediated self-consciousness, end of quote, cited by Zahavi. Thus, Professor Zahavi states, quote, to stand an IU relation is to stand in a relation of mutual address, where you experience the other as a subject with perspective on yourself and vice versa. Not only are your experience of the other and your self-experience intertwined, but they are also bound up and synchronously co-regulated with her self-experience and her experience of you, end of quote. So far, we could say that in the example we have taken and developed, we were consistent with the approach proposed by Dahlberg et al. 2009, who explained the need to consider the patient's existential situation in the world in order to provide adequate care. This care is person-centered care, which Zahavi brings into play when addressing the link between phenomenology and nursing in 2024. This person-centered approach to care clearly responds to a commitment to a second-person perspective. But what will happen in that minimal care community, if we may call that fundamental dyad or triad, if we consider the norms and practices of the care institution, if the patient fainted upon feeling the contact of the needle? According to the above, strictly speaking, there will be no IU relationship, no reciprocity, and no communication if we take it in the narrow sense in the situation where the nurse observes the fainted patient. In fact, the book gives examples of mutual observation or otherwise observation that are no relationships of this type. A lover watching their partner sleep, two people looking at each other without realizing it at a party, observing another person's expressive behavior, feeling moved by an actor in a movie. Zahavi asserts that there is no strong subject-subject relationship where the participants intentionally intertwine. However, it will seem that we will want to continue to uphold person-centered care. The patient is not an anonymous person to the nurse with whom they were talking. Based on this, I would like to raise some questions with Professor Zahavi in order to further explore the concept of a minimal community of care and the experiences of the relationships that comprises it. One possibility that arises is to abandon or relax the requirement of reciprocity and mutual address, as Reddy does. For one, quote, the relational component of second-person relations hint at in the notion of social interaction and suggested by the notions of reciprocity and mutuality is considerably downplayed, end of quote. enabling an ambivalence between a rigid conception of the second person distanced from the third, and one in which there is a greater continuity, which do not differ in structure. This is 2018, quoted by Leon et al. In 2022. But in addition to this, we should broaden our conception of communication by considering not only nonverbal gestural communication, but also unintentional communication. Another possibility is to consider a type of reciprocity and communication different from those explained so far. For example, the one that Professor Batan-Horenstein brought up in her comment. Empirical research has found that breathing and heartbeats as subpersonal or physiological processes experienced by caregivers and children and by couples in love are regulated, synchronized, and show reciprocal action in a kind of organic dialogue. Kovalinka, Evans, Knowledge, 2023. The third and last possibility for us will be to abandon the pretense of maintaining the second person perspective in situations where a caregiver intervenes, not just observes, with care practices in a fainted patient, with whom they were recently talking about their fears. Or we could also think of care relationships in patients with mental disorders, various types of amnesia, Alzheimer, etc. I'm grateful to Professor Zahavi for allowing us to consider these fundamental questions for care practices and ethics, and to continue developing the possibilities of phenomenology in its concrete applications in the world of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Now, Dan, you have time to defend yourself. And and I made a mistake in with the program. We have a little extra time. Maybe we can have a longer pause. I mean, if so, take your time to respond. It's not necessarily 15 minutes. You can take more.
So, well, thanks so much to both of the commentators for these very insightful questions. And so I'm wondering, and there's, I mean, I think it was nice that they were put together, because I think there's a clear kind of continuity or overlap between the kind of issues that they that they bring up. So I think when it comes to Ariela's comments, I mean, I wonder whether we really disagree. I mean, because I think I would agree with most of what you are saying. But I mean, there was one thing that kind of puzzled me a little bit, and perhaps that's a way of starting. So you basically claim that some of the examples I use might be interpreted as supporting a certain instrumental understanding of embodiment. And I have to say, I don't really understand that, because, I mean, take the case of walking together. I mean, why would that exemplify an instrumental understanding of embodiment? It's not as if, I don't know, some free-floating Cartesian subject is pulling the strings to allow a certain body then to perform certain actions. I think that would be an extremely unnatural way of explaining what is happening when we are walking together. I think walking together will actually serve pretty well as an example of something that is not goal direct. It's not as if we are walking together necessarily to go to or to reach a certain destination. No, it's the very bodily being together that is its own reward, so to speak. So I think walking together, well, so again, I was just, why is this instrumental? I mean, I couldn't get that. It's a bit like also saying, what if, two people were hugging each other, and then one was saying, well, that's a very instrumental understanding of embodiment that is brought forth through this example. So that's just weird. I mean, I think hugging together is precisely something that is so embodied through and through that it would be impossible to really divide or divorce the psychological and the embodied side. So I think, I was a little bit thrown off course by that specific kind of claim. But I think apart from that, I think I would agree. I mean that I think I could have said more in part one about the role of embodiment. It's not really something that I'm saying a lot about. I mean, what I am saying occasionally, and not just once, but occasionally, is that I don't think an account of we would be compatible with a disembodied view of the self that took it to be some kind of hidden interiority. So I am kind of saying on some cases, or on some occasions, that I don't think a disembodied account of self could make it intelligible how something like a we is possible. Of course, saying that is not to, I mean, it's not the end of the story. So of course one could have said more about the body and the role of embodiment for selfhood. I mean, I concede all of that. I have in some places said a bit more. I could have said more, but I would say that if there is a place where I do think I keep emphasizing the role of embodiment, that would then be in part two, because I think the whole account of face-to-face relationship, the whole criticism of the invisibility thesis, it's all about the role of bodily expressivity. It's about to what extent bodily expressivity gives us a certain understanding of the mind of the other. And I'm basically saying, emotional sharing could not occur were it not for the fact that we are the embodied creatures we are. And there's even some, I mean, there's some place, and this, I mean, this relates a bit to this discussion of the subpersonal physiological processes that both of you were calling attention to. I mean, there's a place in one of the chapters where I'm discussing the work of Collins and his work on the role of micro-temporal bodily coordination, to what extent that might serve as a certain social glue, to what extent bodily entrainment, bodily resonance might serve for identification. So I do think, I mean, so again, I mean, it's like this. I mean, you can't satisfy everybody, and I mean, clearly, I could have said more about the body. I accept that, but I think we are more or less on board, or I'm in agreement with you. And I guess the only thing that I would like perhaps to mention at the end, and perhaps this is something we could perhaps also take up in the final Q&A. Thank you. It's of course this issue of yeah. So let me put it like this: there are some people who have been criticizing me from the other side. So they haven't said you have not said enough about the embodiment. No, what they are saying is you're putting too much focus on embodiment because you keep talking about the face-to-face relationship. And what is the relation of, or what is the relevance of face-to-face relationship in our increasingly digitalized world where we all, on social media and nobody is ever seeing anybody in person? And is it not possible on those platforms to have we formations where actually the role of embodiment is minimal? And I mean, I think there's a way of responding to that. But I just find it a bit funny. I mean, that this is also where I have received some criticism. So really, coming from the very opposite side and saying, well, there's too much focus on, old-fashioned embodiment. Okay, so let me kind of slowly transgress or move on to the second comment. So because I think because I just want to make one more comment about these subpersonal mechanisms. So you were referring to this study by Kovalinka, Sebans, and Knoblich, and I mean I know some of the earlier work, and I mean I don't remember all the details, but there is a very famous, very quoted article by them where they're discussing and analyzing Spanish firewall rituals. And I mean, again, so apparently in Spain, I mean, this might be closer to you than to me, but in Spain there is these rituals where people are walking on burning coal for a certain distance, and when there must be some reason behind that, which kind of escapes me at the moment. But this is a tradition that people are, I think, also training for. And so I think, if I remember the study correctly, what the researchers found out by monitoring heart rate, frequency and rhythm between the people who were doing the fire walking and their, what is the term? Their partners who were observing them, they discovered that there were synchrony. So somehow people who were more emotionally related to the people walking on the fire, somehow, their whole bodily system started to work in sync. And this is, of course, interesting. One might, of course, wonder, and this is an objection philosophers might always make, and I know it's a little bit cheap, is this so surprising? It's good that we now have empirical scientific evidence for this, but is it so surprising? But let me leave that to the side. What I think I would want to ask for, and again, I don't want to settle it here, but just to bring it up for consideration, is the following. What is driving it here? Is it the synchronization of heart rhythm that leads to a certain identification between the person doing the fire walking and the person observing, or is it the other way around? Is it because of the existence of a prior identification, a prior emotional relationship, that the thinking occurs? And somehow I think I would be tempted to vote for the second option. It's because there's already a certain connection between us, that these bodily rhythms also go into synchrony. And I know there are some people who have made the case that again, bodily resonance can be very powerful, but if you really dislike, the other person, it will be you will be much less likely to start also engage in bodily mimicry. So bodily mimicry is another, very low, very bottom up, process where if I'm talking, we're having a conversation, you might start, nodding, and I feel kind of, confirmed by that. I'm kind of nodding as well. So there are all these processes going on between us, which I think is important also for us having a certain bond. But I also think it's kind of interesting that if you happen to dislike me a lot, or vice versa, there will be less nodding going on. There will be less kind of bodily mimicry. And so that this seems to suggest, that there might also be a certain top-down influence. So it's not just bottom-up. The process is somewhat more complicated. Okay, that was just a very quick comment, because I want to move on to what I take to be the main point of your comment, which has to do with, this is the way I understand it. It's a bit like putting a certain pressure on my account of second person engagement by pointing to what one could call, marginal cases, or puzzle cases. And so you have the example with the patient that faints. And so the question is, well, what kind of relationship can the nurse then have to that fainted person? Is it no longer, can she or he no longer offer person-centered care to that person? And here I would say that there's something that is going wrong in that, I think, example. So So I think out of time concern, let me cut it a little bit short. So I think what is wrong here is the idea that there are only two options. Either we have a person-centered understanding of the other that is driven by and linked to second personal reciprocal relations. That's the one option. The other option is that we have a kind of third personal anonymous relation. And those are the only two options. And if those are the only two options, well, then clearly the case with the fainted patient is odd, because how are we supposed to fit that in with those two options? But I think what we should do is to reject the idea that there are only those two options. I just think this is a mistake. And I think that, I mean, perhaps part of where the mistake is coming from has to do with the brief reference to Schütz's distinction between DAO orientation and day orientation, because I mean Schütz does, operate with that distinction, but I think it would be a mistake, and he does say, that the DAO orientation is really bound to the living we relationship of the face-to-face relationship, and if that relationship is no longer there, not a DAO, you don't have a DAO orientation, then it has to be a day orientation. But Schütz also goes on to say that there are many different types of day orientation. So, I mean, I can relate now to the anonymous manufacturers of microphones. I really don't know much about them. I mean, they are probably working X number of hours per day. They probably need sustenance. They have to sleep. I mean, this is a very, very anonymous description of the producers of microphones. So clearly, that's an anonymous way of relating. But my mother, who is currently not present, I mean, for Schütz, I would also have a day relationship to her. So because there are certain typifications that structures my understanding of her. But of course, it would be ridiculous to say that my relationship to my mother is akin to my relationship to the producers of microphones. But of course, I have extremely intimate knowledge of the individuality of my mother, even though I do not stand in a DAO orientation to her. So I think the day orientation again covers a whole variety of different modalities, and Schütz would say, my mother or a friend, I mean, the moment he leaves my immediate physical surrounding, then I'm relating to him in terms of typifications, in terms of a day orientation, but it can be a very determinate, very specific, very individualized understanding nevertheless. So that even though we are talking about typifications, Schütz says, well, it can be typifications in the sense of he or she is probably behaving in the same way that he or she used to do. So there is a typification, but of course, it's still a very individualized typification, very different from relating to the producers of microphones who also need to have food, to sleep, etc., etc. So all of that is supposed to make the point that person-centered care, I mean, a care that is not just anonymous, but that somehow relates to, the individual in front of you. I mean, I don't think that has to be, well, it's not as if the moment you are no longer in a second person relationship, well, then you cease being able to offer person-centered care, because it can be person-centered in the sense of still trying to, I don't know, respect the wishes and desires of the patient you're trying to offer healthcare to. How do you know about those desires and preferences? Well, one option is that you have previously been speaking with him or her, and so there has been second-person relationship. Now there is no longer second-person relationship, but it's still a person-centered care because you are drawing from all the insights you have previously obtained. Or it could be that, a colleague of yours, I mean, another nurse, have had second-person relationships, have written down a lot of information about what this person that you have never yourself had second-person relationship to is interested in, prefers, likes, values, etc., etc. And your care is now being, modulated or influenced by that information. So I would still say, well, it still counts as person-centered care, even though it's not second-personal. So I think this would be my way. So I think, again, just to wrap up, I mean, I think I would say, it's the alternative that we have to reject, the alternative of either being anonymous or it has to be second personal. I mean, that's just a an artificial, problem. And I think the moment we reject that, I think we can then admit that the fainted patient is still something we can offer a person-centered care to, without having to go in and start to tweak the definitions of what a second-person relationship is, because that would of course be the other option. I mean, the option would be to say, well, somehow we need to say that it's person-centered care, and the only reason we can say that is because it remains second personal. And since the person is fainted, well, then we need to redefine second personal so that it no longer involves reciprocity, mutual address, etc., etc. But I think that that would be the wrong way, because I think we would then water out what I think still remains one of the crucial features of the second person relation, that there is that forth and back going on. So that what I think kind of wraps it up. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Sahavitz. I agree with you. It was just a motive to engage with the commentary, but I still think that you have not defined body in the text. You talk about embodiment, but you don't define the body, and that is a question. Which type of body are you referring to? And the other thing is the example. I thought a lot during the summer, because I went for a walk with my husband, and he invited me, and he told me, would you come for a walk with me? And I thought, I don't have any ganas, Luft, me sale, no, ganas. I didn't want to go, but I know that I have been a lot of the time sitting, studying, working, and I need to work. I need to walk. And during this walking, I thought we have two different motivations for our working together, and we are acting like, in a sense, we are supposing, in the example of the working together, I think that is presuppose the transparency of the consciousness. We are both think from ourselves, from the other, that we are thinking the same. We are walking for a walk together because we want to go for a walk together, and that was not my case in that point, no. And because of that, I thought, okay, now this is an example of using my body. I am using my body to find an activity, and my husband think that we are making an activity. That is a collective intentionality. Please don't tell my husband that I'm making this confession now, but that was the point. I thought in this example especially, because the other two are especially are clearer, but with working together, I thought, okay, we are supposing the same transparency of consciousness, and because of that, we are using instrumental use of the body.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your commentary. Well, I want to ask you then, thank you for catch the perfect sense of the commentary. If you agree with the idea of the temporal dimension of the second person, if we talked a moment ago and we can't talk now, the retention or the remembering of the talking past, available the second person centered action with the person who can't talk now with me, because this is very important for the topic, and there is no synchronicity in real time here and now, but it was a synchronicity.
So let me just quickly reply to that question, because I think you are right I mean, for those of you who might have studied extremely carefully my work, well, I mean, might have discovered that there's actually a change. There's a change between the article called observation, interaction, communication. There's a difference between what I'm saying there and what I'm saying in the book. And it precisely has to do with this specific point. And I mean, I have to admit that I was forced to change my view partly on the basis of Professor Lloydall's critical comments, because what I ended up writing in the book is so basically the kind of challenge would be the following. If one says that, you know, having a second person relation is something that really involves the synchronization, well, what then about cases where, you know, the patient is fainted or the person is sleeping? Would that then mean that in those cases, well, then you are really relating to the person in question from a third person perspective as a he or she? And there seems to be something slightly odd about that. I mean, if you had just had a very lively second person relation, why can't you continue to think about the person second personally, even when the person is no longer able to respond? And so in order to deal with that specific challenge, I mean, what I basically did in the book was to recall a classical distinction that Husserl makes between signative intentions and intuitive intentions. And I then said, well, you can have a you thought in the case, in those cases where the persons don't reciprocate. But you can't have a you intuition or you experience in the full-blown sense, which I think really requires reciprocity from the other. And so I think using that kind of distinction, I think I would say, well, I mean, if you have had second-person relations and you then no longer have it, I mean, your relationship to the person in question will, of course, be changed, transformed, I mean, compared to people you have never had second-person relationships to. So you can think and you can relate differently to those persons, but I just don't think it will give you the kind of, I mean, living relationship or the experience or the intuition where I really think, reciprocity and mutual address is required. So I think this would be the way I would deal with it.
Okay. So thank you, Dan, Alejandro, Ariela, for these great comments. I was thinking now I should reread the book in light of what Dan said today. So now we finished with this first panel. We have a coffee pause. We will enjoy delicious pastries that Michaela Seftel brought today. And so thank you. And I think we can take 20 minutes because, or maybe 25, yeah. So